What's up, summoners, and welcome back to another ProGuides Wild Rift video. And for today we're going to talk about builds and what difference they make in order for you to win more games. So let's just go. And on the first champion slot we have Zed. Zed as a champion is an assassin and loves to dominate the enemy. Whenever you see Zed on the enemy team, you already know it's a bad time if you've locked in an AD carry or a support champion, at least if you're a squishy support. However, there's one thing that Zed players need to be very mindful of. It's their early game. Because in the early game, Zed needs to play relatively slow and careful. He doesn't want to lose too much HP because doing so would make him lose gold and XP in the long run. However, he wants to poke you down or trade you towards the 50% threshold so he can one-shot you on his next set of cooldowns. If he's running Electrocute, be extra mindful of his cooldown, because usually if he pays attention to it, he centers his all-ins or burst rates around his cooldown. But the real scary part about Zed begins the moment he hits level 5. And even if he died in lane once before, you still need to be very careful. You didn't win yet, and he can still destroy you, especially if he knows about the fact that he cannot miss a single spell if he autocasts everything in your face. And this gets especially problematic the moment he gets his item Cyrilda's Grudge. You cannot move because you're slowed for eternity, and since his shadows deal all damage with his third ability, well, you die quite fast. And now let's talk about runes and builds. For runes, you want to take Electrocute, Brutal, Hunter Titan and Sweet Tooth. In some situations you can also just go Conqueror. Conqueror scales a bit better than Electrocute, especially if you're facing tankier opponents. And also in theory, on paper, proccing Conqueror is a very fast thing. All you need to do is hit all your spells once, especially with the shadows you have, and you get it instantly. For summoner spells, you always want to run Flash and Ignite, it's just too good on this champion. And for items, you want Youmuu's Ghostblade, Black Cleaver or Cyrilda, then again Black Cleaver or Cyrilda, Blade of the Rune King, Guardian Angel, and Defensive Boots plus the Stasis enchant. The reason we go for Youmuu's over Duskblade is the added mobility to our champion. We just want to rotate from the middle lane to other lanes to impact them. And afterwards we can make the decision if we want to have a Black Cleaver. However, taking the recent nerf to Cyrilda or armor pen items into account, assassins were nerfed harder than any other class from that. So it's most likely that we are just going to complete the Black Cleaver because the item gives us so much of what we want. Armor penetration, depending on how many times we hit the enemy, is something that's quite nice for our champion. Because if we use all our spells, it will be instantly stacked on the enemy. So the HP plus the ability haste is something that's quite nice to have. And then to complete the curve, we can just go for the Cyrilda afterwards to maximize our damage. To make sure we deal even more damage, we can make use of the Blade of the Rune King, thanks to its passive, that is stronger for melee champions, and abuse it with our ultimate scaling. And last but not least, the Guardian Angel is just a placeholder for whatever you want to build in that slot. There's nothing wrong with building Guardian Angel, but if you think about the future and the future Caitlyn release, well, Guardian Angel as an item will be significantly weaker. Why? Because the moment you die and the moment she realizes you have Guardian Angel, she's gonna place a trap onto your face and well, that's it for you. And do you like the content? If so, leave a sub and like to get all of it in the future. And now a small break for a question of the day. Where do you usually play Wild Rift and what's the story behind why you play Wild Rift, where you play it? Let me know in the comments below. And next up comes a champion that has become quite the menace on the Rift. This champion is absolutely busted whenever it has to deal damage. A well-played Vayne also can trade decently well in lane. It doesn't really matter what she's facing, she can still do fine if she's better than the opponent, which is obviously not a factor you can always consider as true. And all for that she has to do is use your auto attack reset and the auto attacks well. Additionally, of course, dodging skill shots from the enemy team just to make sure you mitigate the damage the most you can. But now let's talk about what makes her so unbelievably strong. For one, it's the attack speed steroid on her second ability in combination with all the attack speed items Vayne can build. With those items, she becomes the monster you need to be careful of. Because other AD carries are usually victims of champions that jump onto them. However, you are not stuck with them, they are stuck with you, which usually means the end for them very fast after. And to make sure you deal the most damage with this champion, go for Conqueror, Brutal or Vampirism, most likely Vampirism, Hunter Titan and Sweet Tooth. For summoner spells, take Flash and Barrier and sometimes even Exhaust instead of Barrier. For items, you rush Blade of the Rune King, Charge Blade or Wit's End depending on what you're facing, and on the third slot a Wit's End or an Infinity Edge, then a Bloodthirster and then a Guardian Angel. For boots, you want Gluttonous with either Proto Belt, Stasis, or Gargoyle. So let's talk about the items at first. Since Vayne features a lot of attack speed, on-hit becomes very strong in this champion, because every of these items with on-hit also features attack speed on top, which means more second ability procs, more true damage, and overall more damage. Now with our low cooldown on our first ability, Charge Blade becomes a very broken item for us, because it grants us crit chance and bonus magic damage on it in case we crit. And when we are facing a lot of magical damage, just a Wit's End can make us invincible. And afterwards, it's just getting about more crit to deal more damage. And now we talk about something very specific on Vayne. When you're going for the Stasis enchant, you usually stun yourself for 2.5 seconds where you can't move, which means if the enemy team is already winning, quote unquote, they will kill you just after. But what about using Gargoyle? Most of your damage can be considered coming from your true damage anyway. And now since you're reducing your normal damage, but not reducing your true damage, you can still be mobile. And in some situations or in some games, this added mobility will carry you more likely than any other enchant. Obviously you have to judge this by game case, but just sometimes it will win you the game. And next up comes a champion that is very similar to Vayne in that sense that he deals a lot of damage, however he usually deals that damage on his free item spike. Before that you might consider him hitting like a wet noodle, but after those 3 items he's gonna destroy everything that touches him. But now let's talk about the things that make this champion awful. Number 1, Essence Reaver, number 2, Blade of the Rune King, and number 3, Black Cleaver. Those are the worst 3 items you can build on this character, and why that is? Well, he scales way too good with crit, and getting access to those free crit items makes his power spike 50 times stronger than any other build available. You should test it and give me your feedback on it. And trust me, you'll be more than surprised. Another thing about Lucian is that in lane he cannot really miss his first ability, so taking that into account, he can start to poke out the enemy really early on in that lane to prepare an all-in shortly after. So let's talk about his items for a second and his runes. For runes you take Conqueror, Brutal or yet again Vampirism, Hunter Titan and Sweet Tooth. For summoner spells take Flash and Barrier, and depending if you're playing solo lane, take Ignite. For items you want Infinity Edge, Charge Blade, and Navori Quick Blades into Cyrilda's Grudge, Bloodthirster, and defensive or Gluttonous Boots with a defensive enchant. But now let's talk about why Navori Quick Blades on the 3rd slot. With Navori Quick Blades and our passive and the crit overall rate we have at that point, we'll get a lot of cooldown reduction on all our spells, which means more spells, more passive procs, more damage, which consequently leads to the question, is it better than Armor Pen at that point? With the added mobility in mind and the added burst damage and the recent nerf to Cyrilda, yes, it will be better. However, depending on the game you're playing and depending on how many times you are allowed to auto-attack, maybe in some cases Cyrilda's Grudge 3rd will be better. But generally speaking, Navori 3rd will always be the better choice. Because what is worse than a Lucian that one-shots you? A Lucian that permanently dashes around, can't be locked down and one-shots everyone on your team. And from there we move on to the next solo queue stomping champion, Irelia. And let me introduce this champion with one thing. Irelia is probably one of the hardest champions to play in this game, especially for the fact that you have to manually cast everything to make sure that the champion is used to his fullest potential. The reason for this is rather simple. The autocast can put you in situations in which you can't play anymore. You automatically dash to something you didn't want to dash to, and then you stand there with your pants down and get beaten up, which is something you normally don't want to. And the next thing about Irelia as a champion is that Trinity Force is a big bait. Number 1, it's way too expensive, and number 2, provides way too little. Rather go on hit into a bruiser way of building, then you deal more damage and you tank more damage. It's actually insane how little the Triforce provides you. And with the on hit build, all you need to make sure of is get 4 stacks and beat the enemy to death. It's very easy and not really complicated, if you obviously manage to get the 4 stacks, which is quite easy if you hit an ultimate in a teamfight. However, let's talk about runes and builds. For runes you want to take Conqueror, Brutal or yet again Vampirism, Hunter Titan and Sweet Tooth. For summoner spells take Flash and Ignite, and for items Rush Blade of the Rune King, Wit's End, Death Stance or Steric's Gauge, and then another defensive item of your choice which is the best for the game you're playing in. So you see that you're having a lot of choices. But most cases you'll just build Blade of the Rune King into a Death Stance, which is the best build into mostly everything. However, if you're snowballing and the enemy team features a lot of magic damage, you can add a Wit's End for even more on-hit damage. And afterwards, it's just about getting tankier, getting as strong as you physically can by mitigating the most damage possible. because in the long run, thanks to your passive, thanks to Blade of the Ruined King, and thanks to Wit's End, you will win most of your 1v1s in any scenario. And to make sure you win against them in most scenarios, take defensive boots with either Teleport, the QSS or the Proto Belt, depending on what to do. And now let's move over to our last champion of this list. Evelynn. And Evelynn is one of those champions that will always remain relevant in a solo queue context. The reason for this is her being stealth after hitting level 5 is certain damnation for most of the dragon lanes out there. They never pay attention to anything but themselves anyway, jokes aside. But the real problem here is that people usually don't pay attention to this kind of champion. They don't track her and they'll play overly aggressive and get punished by the Evelynn. And even if Evelynn got nerfed many patches ago, she still deals a lot of damage if she's ahead. And even if she's not ahead on level 5, she can still one-shot you without any problem in the world. However, her greatest weakness is the gargoyle meta. The more tankier a champion gets, the more problematic it becomes for the Evelynn to do anything. But even taking this into account, there's still a lot Evelynn can make work on the map. For example, since she is stealth, make sure to find proper angles to gank from when you play her. Don't just path like a normal jungle, because you're invisible, make use of that, wards don't matter to you at all. Which means on the flip side, if you're playing against an Evelynn, make sure you ward some camps to have a higher chance of spotting her. And for the build, we have Electrocute or Conqueror, Brutal Hunter Titan, and Mastermind or Pathfinder. For summoner spells, we have Flash and Smite. For the build, we have Prophet's Pendant with the Magic Pen, Rabadon's Death Cap, Lich Bane, Void Staff, and then we finish the Infinity Orb or the Morellos, and then we build the one we haven't built yet for more Magic Pen. With this build, we'll deal true damage to probably champions up to 55 MR, which includes every single carry in the game, unless they itemize a magic defensive item, which is quite problematic for most carries because there are no real good items for them. Maw is a terrible item and Wit's End can't be built by just anyone. And building a full completed defensive item like a Spirit Visage or something along those lines really takes away from their damage. And for boots, Evelynn wants the Lucidity boots with the Proto Belt enchant. With this, it's impossible to get away from her. And that's basically it for today's video. Thank you for watching and don't forget to leave a sub and like to the channel to make sure you never miss anything again. See you tomorrow.